Welcome to DIA Today, Democracy in America Today. I'm Matt Parks alongside David Corbin. Glad to have you with us as we explore the ideas behind today's headlines. It's been a very difficult week, Dave.
Yeah, sad on many fronts. Not happy to wake up each day and see the previous night's devastation. It's even tougher when you teach these things, politics, philosophy, civics, etc., because so much of what you're trying to do as a teacher is to teach young men and women how we can live within a political community, even though we're different from one another. We can have different opinions and not necessarily agree all the time, but learn how to deliberate and to go back and forth and to freely exchange ideas and to vote and to do things where sometimes we win and sometimes we lose, but at the end of the day, we don't turn to violence and we don't turn to wanting to hurt one another or overcome each other. And that's a horrible thing to see when you see pictures of that in the midst of rightful protests.
Yeah, of course, one of the things that's, I think, central to our teaching as we particularly teach on the American regime is the principle of human equality. This is really the moral heart of the American regime. And when you give that up, and you give that up in particular for a principle that might makes right, which is really the alternative principle that we see exhibited in police brutality, in looters, in the violent response to violence, and the back and forth that we get as this goes day by day, we see there's just really ultimately no hope in that for justice. And if we want to have a clear view of a direction that we want to take things, we have to figure out the pathway back to justice, beginning with the first principle of justice, as the American regime sets it forth most famously in the Declaration of Independence: all men are created equal. So as we work through this today, one of the reasons that I stopped watching local news was the absurdity of the theater that surrounds it. So you start with a story about a tornado that wipes out several houses and businesses, and then the anchor turns to the sports reporter and says something like, "Speaking of natural disasters, Bill, whatever happened to the Yankees last night?" And it's just so incongruous, right? You got this the human tragedy on the one hand, and then now we're talking about how the Yankees blew a 3-run lead in the 9th inning or something like that. So if you've listened to our first 2 episodes, we're trying to mix serious reflection on political ideas with some more lighthearted personal stories and commentary on sports and culture. But we don't want to be like my imaginary news broadcast this week. So we're going to tread lightly on the humor while we focus on the problems of race, police misconduct, law and order that are so plainly in sight in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd and the protests and riots that have followed. So let's start with some headlines. And we begin, at least at the beginning of this story, with the brutal killing of George Floyd by police officer Derek Chauvin during an arrest that involved 3 other police officers on May 25th. So 4 days later, Chauvin was originally charged with 3rd-degree murder and manslaughter. And then this week, Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison, a name you may remember as a former Democratic congressman from Minnesota, amended the complaint against Chauvin to add a charge of 2nd-degree murder and filed separate charges against the other 3 officers. And so, as we all know, since Floyd's death, there's been both peaceful protests and non-peaceful protests amid multifaceted calls for change, from specific reforms regarding policing techniques and police accountability to general calls to repudiate racism and white supremacy to what can only be described as revolutionary and even nihilistic demands. So we're going to take a look at this in these 3 different dimensions and try to sort through it a little bit from the headlines and then take that step back that's really central to this program and think about where we can get some historical and philosophical perspective on this. We'll begin by looking at the issue of the abuse of police power. So Raphael Mangual, writing at the City Journal, tries to understand this significance of the incidence of death by the hands of police officers, particularly shootings. In recent years, there's been about 1,000 deaths per year, and that's out of a total number of arrests of 10 million, about 10 million arrests each year. About 1,000 of those annually have led to the death of the person being arrested. Perhaps more relevant for the particular case is the number of incidents where the person was unarmed, which has fluctuated in recent years. Last year, there were 28 unarmed individuals who were killed in the process of arrest. In 2015, the number was 70. Now, for a little more historical perspective, 1971, New York City police discharged their firearms 810 times, wounding 221 individuals and killing 93. In 2016, that was 72 times, about 1/10 the number, wounding 23 and killing 9. So in New York City, there's been a rather substantial reduction in incidents of violence between the police and those that they're seeking to arrest. So with that context, then there's a real fascinating article in The Atlantic that lays out 13 different ways that you could actually move forward in improving policing in the United States. 3 social scientists that propose these at the federal level, the state level, and the local level. I'm just going to highlight a couple of them. One, they suggest at the federal level is an increase in data collection. So there's a surprising lack of information with regard to the use of violence. At the state level, they particularly see the value of updating laws on the use of deadly and non-deadly force. There's some states that have done that in recent years and made some significant progress in reducing incidents of death and violence between police and civilians, and amending laws that govern collective bargaining to promote personal accountability and responsibility on the part of police officers. The last thing they mentioned for the states is to take steps against over-criminalization. And I guess the thing that jumped out at me in those numbers, Dave, is that there were 10 million arrests in 2018. And so while the number of deaths per arrest is obviously a small percentage, the fact that there were 10 million arrests suggests either we have lots and lots of crime and a very serious crime problem, or that perhaps things that don't need to be crimes are leading to arrests.
Yeah, I find that number also incredibly high. If you were to ask me, how many people are arrested in the United States each year, I would have probably given you a number that fell under 1 million. So the fact that it's 10 times that number, and that's a lot of the wrong type of relationship between civil society and law officers who are hired to serve and protect.
Yeah, so I mean, in our town, when we see the police, we see them driving around, and we see occasional traffic stops and things of that sort. And there aren't more serious incidents than that, but we also see them at the Christmas parade with all their squad cars decked out, and we see them at the town fair day where they open up the car and you can climb through, and right. So you have those kind of positive interactions in the community that build trust and create a sense of a common purpose in maintaining the peace and the order of that community. And so obviously they have their job to do in enforcing the law, and no doubt that's happening. But there's other interactions, right, that are common interactions for citizens. And therefore the overall narrative is different than it would be if we constantly saw them only enforcing laws, and every interaction, whether it was with you and the police or or a neighbor and the police was a matter of confrontation, right? With heightened passions on at least one side, perhaps both.
Well, I go back to where you began in your opening monologue, that relationship between the law enforcement officer and the citizenry that is based on the precept that all men are created equal, that you lead, you serve another as you would want to be led and served. You enforce laws as you'd want them to be enforced against you. That's an all men are created equal way of doing law enforcement. There's a might makes right, a way of doing law enforcement as well. And I just your story kind of brings to mind why we moved to Canyon Lake in Texas, which is right near New Braunfels, Como County. I remember going the first time we were here a couple of years ago, visiting the area. We went to a famous place called Green Hall, where they have music and people dance and they drink Shinerbach and all the rest. And the whole town is filled with the joy of just having a great day on a weekend and enjoying it with your family. And I remember the sheriff, I believe it was the sheriff, he was a police officer, but he could have been the sheriff of the county. He was directing traffic outside of the hall and joking with people as they were walking by, reprimanding cars that wouldn't stop, et cetera, but just doing so in a very funny manner. And then he went in as the band was finishing its set for the day and performed with the band on its last song, and then said to the assembled crowd of 400, all right, guys, take a break now, have a coffee. I don't want to pull you over. I want you to get home safely and start your week off right. And I just said to myself, boy, this is what America should be. And it was just a really kind of great service that this sheriff had performed. This was a black sheriff of a predominantly white county, and everyone knew him and loved him, and that's the direct opposite of what we see in some communities where there is no communion between these two groups. So I know we're looking for a pathway forward, and we're not going to be able to do that in a 40-minute podcast, but I think there's some light there it's not just simply in New Braunfels, Green, or Suffern. It's there. There are a lot of great police officers, and there are a lot of great citizens working with police officers. So there's a lot of good going on. We don't hear much about that good, but I think that's the pathway forward for our country.
Yeah, there's a lot of stories of progress in terms of community policing and things of that sort, even in neighborhoods of large cities and other places where it may feel like you don't have that same human scale kind of interaction. But from our time in New York City, what was striking to us was in some ways how small a town in a way you lived in. We most of our life was about a 10-minute walk one way or another. And so there was even though it's buildings and cement and all the rest, there's not a lot of trees, but there could be a sense of community. And you had to work at it. It was going to look different than it would in a small suburban town or some other part of the country, but it wasn't impossible. And so I think that sense of community and also the sense of people invested in that community. And of course, that too can be a challenge in places where people are more transient, but to be invested in that community, boy, it makes a difference. And it makes a difference on both sides, right? The people that you see day by day, year after year, builds trust and opportunities for de-escalating when things get tense that are difficult perhaps to find otherwise. So we're going to kind of pull back one more step here, and obviously the broader context of this killing, because it was a white police officer and a black victim, was the overall question of race in America. But just a couple of pieces that caught my eye that kind of show maybe the range of the debate on this as we work forward. So first, this is Ibram Kendi in The Atlantic. This piece is entitled "The American Nightmare," and it's playing on the idea of the American dream and contrasting that with the American nightmare. And he says, "Perhaps the worst of the nightmare is knowing that racist Americans will never end it. Anti-racism is on you," meaning the black community, "and only you. Racist Americans, deny your nightmare, deny their racism, claim you have a dream like a king, when even his dream in 1967 turned into a nightmare. And he links to an article, an interview that Martin Luther King did in 1967, where he said his dream had turned into a nightmare, and had sort of some second thoughts on the optimism of his famous 1963 I Have a Dream speech. Now, on the other side of that, Andrew McCarthy, writing on the issue of institutional racism, particularly in the context of policing. So he's a former federal prosecutor and makes a broader comment at the conclusion of his piece. He says, the African-American community is not a monolith. Like other segments of the American population, it is diverse and dynamic. The policies pushed by progressives damage the parts of it that need the most help. And the false narrative of racist police, which pressures law enforcement to back off from the communities most victimized by crime, is now destroying entire cities. Broadly competing narratives here. And of course, this folds into a debate that's been going on since last year when the New York Times published its 1619 project. Is the American project fundamentally a racist project, 1619, the date that the first slaves arrived in Virginia? Or is the real story of the United States 1776? And we've quoted the Declaration of Independence already. Which is the dominant narrative? Which is the one that gives us best access into the meaning of the American experience? That's sort of the longer view question. And then the question of where we are today and how we can move forward.
On this question of 1619 versus 1776, going back to something I said earlier, we're always trying to make the total case that okay, what can we can prove completely that X is the case, and I think that's a very, very incorrect thing to do, especially when you're taking on this subject that's as touchy as this. You and I both teach American civilization and culture. We teach what's happened over the last 400 years, but we do so, I think, hopefully, in a humble way. You try as much as possible to get a sense as to what happened and to why it happened. And a lot of what happened, or if not all of what happened and why it happened, boils down to decisions that human beings made given their circumstances. And there are macro political or historical decisions that political communities make to go to war against the British, say, in 1776. To go to war against Germany and the Axis powers prior to World War II. But there are a lot of micro political decisions or historical decisions that are made by individual human beings. And you see the complexity of human life and human history when you take into account what's happening at the macro political or macro historical level, and at the micro political or micro historical level. You think about how many millions, hundreds of millions of Americans have made decisions over the course of the last 400 years. Right now, our population is some 340 million Americans. My guess is, it's just a guess, you're probably talking about the decisions made by 800, 900, 1 billion Americans. And each of us, we know this from our individual lives, there are some decisions that we regret. There's some choices that we've made that are bad. Other choices that are good, but that there's complexity in our individual lives. So to say systemic X or systemic Y is to try to imprint upon a very complex human story or human experience a statement or a precept. And I think that when you do that, you really lead people astray.
One of the interesting parts of this, which we're going to come back around to Abraham Lincoln in the next segment, but for Lincoln, 1619 and 1776 are both important. So the Gettysburg Address, 7 years ago, right back to 1776. But in his second inaugural address, he says it's 250 years of unrequited toil, and 250 years from 1865 takes you all the way back into the early 1600s. So this is the complexity of the American story. Right, 250 years of injustice, 250 years of unrequited toil of slaves up to 1865, and of course injustices layered on top of that in the years since, but also a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And it's holding those two ideas together and somehow figuring out how they move forward, how a nation moves forward in light of the history and the aspiration. I think that's going to be a big theme of where we're going to go in the next segment as well. So the last piece of this is the response. And so the rallies, the riots, the calls for revolution, different layers of all this. We've seen former President Obama putting out a statement as well, decrying violence, arguing in favor of first rallying and protesting, other than moving toward political action, and particularly responding to those that argue that political action can't help, and directing people especially toward local offices. So trying to encourage people to get involved in local politics, where so many of the key decisions regarding policing and law enforcement, all the rest, are made. So we have that on the one hand, but on the other hand, we had a number of individuals who are giving defenses of violent protests. So a piece by Wellesley professor Kelly Carter Jackson entitled "Riots Are the American Way." And she concludes the piece, "A riot may be temporary violence, quick and dirty, but it could become a revolution. And though slow and long-lasting, when it is fully mature, a revolution is irrefutable change." So one of the things that we're wrestling with is how violence fits into all of this. And again, we've got these competing perspectives on that. The last piece I'll mention briefly is Yuval Levin, writing at National Review. He goes back to another speech by Abraham Lincoln, one of his earliest speeches, where he warns of the danger of reacting with lawlessness to perceived injustices. And although the common concern that arises in that context is a concern that individuals will kind of get swept up in it all, and so the innocent will be punished alongside with the guilty, right? The problem with vigilantism is that vigilante mobs are not very good at discerning who's actually guilty. There's no opportunity for judgment. There's no opportunity to cross-examine witnesses. It's not rough justice. It's just injustice. That's the typical concern. But as Levin points out, Lincoln's concerned with that, but he's even more fundamentally concerned with the fact that once lawlessness sets in, going back to the point we've been making earlier, once lawlessness sets in, it becomes very difficult for anybody to remain attached to the regime itself. That if we can't expect basic safety, if we find ourselves constantly endangered, then all the rest of life, all the good things we might otherwise do, become essentially impossible, because our only focus is on safety. And if you go back to the Declaration of Independence, it talks about safety and happiness. And Harry Jaffa talks about this as the alpha and omega of political life. Right? You begin with safety, but safety is meant to then be the bridge toward happiness, the foundation upon which you pursue happiness. You have to have safety, but you don't end with safety, right? Safety provides the context in which you pursue happiness. But of course, if you don't have safety, then there's no way to do that. And I think there's a lot there for us to think about in terms of violence as a instrument of political power, whether that's the political power exercised by an immoral police officer, or whether that's the political power exercised by a mob in the streets. Well, let's now turn our focus to our required reading and take a step back, as we do each week, and look at the historical context, the ideas that can help us to understand these very challenging and troubling events better. So Dave, what are you assigning this week?
Well, I have 4 things to assign. I'm sorry. There's more required reading or viewing than regular weeks. And I'm sure this won't be the first time that we take a stab at working through these issues. I don't think, unfortunately, these are going to go away anytime soon. There is nothing new under the sun. These problems aren't new. And I think there are a lot of historical and philosophical resources that we can turn to try to make our way through them. The first thing I'd assign is for everyone to go back and take a look at Homer's Iliad and take a look at the shield of Achilles. The shield of Achilles, of course, tells the picture of two cities. One, a city of peace and happiness, as you just mentioned, where there are weddings and there are legal cases, and a second city that's at war, suffering from faction. It's not that war is not sometimes necessary. Sometimes you need war in order to achieve the peace or to achieve happiness, to be able to protect yourself against an enemy. But when war becomes an end in itself, then a city crumbles. And the second piece I'd assign has to do with this modern tendency or postmodern tendency to want to seek war as an end in itself, or more particularly to seek revolution as an end in itself. And this reading is Hannah Arendt's On Revolution. Arendt, of course, had lived and gave commentary on a lot that had happened in the middle of the 20th century. She took a look at the violence of the 20th century and was interested in what made a revolution good, something that served mankind and served its happiness, as opposed to revolutions that had the opposite result. In most of the book, she deals with the differences between the French Revolution and the American Revolution. But what I want to quote from is a couple lines from the beginning or introduction to the book. She talks about revolution and war, and she does so within the context of violence as a political phenomena. Violence is something not to want to be embraced, but violence is the common denominator for both war and revolution. But there's a type of violence in revolution that's particularly troubling. It's a violence that is forced upon another so that everything and everybody must fall silent. She says this is a type of violence that you would see in a concentration camp of a totalitarian regime. This is a type of violence that you saw in the French Revolution. And it's this violence, this desire for violence, that is dehumanizing. It's dehumanizing because it takes away our very political being, and it seeks to take away our ability to employ our speech. What it takes away, Matt, is our ability to act and to speak, which is the basis of our political life. All to say, human beings are made to speak and to act, to use words and to go after things. To do this rightly is to move, to speak, and to encourage happiness. But a violence that is angry at the current peace, that seeks to silence or deactivate or inactivate a human being, actually furthers the evil that is trying to overcome. And I think that we ought to be mindful of this as we approach such topics as Antifa and approach such attempts made by some forces politically to silence human beings or to tell them that they ought not to act. And I think that if we go down this road where we allow that type of violence to cut away at our speech or to cut away at our activity, then the chaos that is brought forward will not be a chaos unto a better peace and a better happiness, but a silence. If someone says to you, here's the solution to our political problem, I want you to shut up, I want you to kneel down, I want you to apologize. Is that the resolution that we're looking for? Right. Because if that's the resolution that we're looking for, that is the very definition of totalitarianism.
Right. Well, we think about, just the most literal context of that. Of course, George Floyd with a knee on his neck saying, I can't breathe, right? Until he couldn't speak, until he'd been killed. And then you have the response to that. And so, there seems like there's, as you were saying earlier, right, there's not really any political acts that's going to be easily ground with this, because this requires then there be speech in response to the silencing of a man. Right? There must be speech in response to George Floyd's death. But then again, that speech has to allow for dialogue, right? It has to allow for conversation, has to allow for reasoning toward some kind of progress toward justice. And if that speech is associated or attended with those that would simply speak and then silence others, or simply stop speaking and start smashing and destroying, then we lose any opportunity there as well to do that political thing, which Aristotle says human beings are meant to do, right? To talk about justice.
So my third assignment, I'm sorry, I have so many assignments this week, but my third assignment would be for everyone then to read Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail that is an argument. It's an argument against a certain type of activity. It's an argument for a certain type of activity. He argues that he's in Birmingham because injustice is there. And the argument that was put forth by other pastors at the time, that he's just agitating, that he's making things worse, that he's rocking the boat, is not an argument that King thinks is the right argument in this case. And he'll go on in this essay to argue that there are certain laws, there are certain states where some things are considered just, and there has to be a rightful protest against those laws and against those wrong conceptions of justice. But it's in one of the key passages in the speech, he tells us, and I'll just read from the speech, in any nonviolent campaign, there are 4 basic steps. The collection of the facts to determine whether injustice exists. We talked about trying to collect more data on what's going on in our country. Negotiation, dialogue, you just mentioned that. Self-purification, kind of taking a look at one's own soul and one's own fallenness, and then direct action. And he says that we've gone through all of these steps in Birmingham. So I think that is an example, right, of the type of employment of word and deed to overcome injustice and to create a happier society. And one of the essential things when you read through that letter is how much King references the first American revolutionaries and references this idea of natural justice, of natural law, of common precept that all men are created equal. And that common standard is what will lead us forward as a society and make us better.
Yeah, it's a strikingly generous piece in that sense. He quotes Thomas Jefferson. He lauds Thomas Jefferson in a certain sense, not as a slave owner, but as a man who said all men are created equal. And he lauds Abraham Lincoln, not as a man who admitted his own racial prejudices, but as a man who worked toward the end of slavery. And so there's a kind of generosity there that I think is captured well in an earlier speech, The Power of Nonviolence, from 1957. He talks about the ultimate goal of nonviolent action being the creation of a beloved community. And begins the passage that ends with that statement by saying that we do not seek to humiliate or defeat the opponent, but to win his friendship and understanding. And that's tough, right? And it might be that was too much, right? That at certain points maybe King came to the conclusion that was going to be too hard to do. But what he says just above that is that this method of non-violence is non-aggressive physically, but strongly aggressive spiritually. And I think this is what really captures the essence of King's approach, and the power of his approach to pursuing justice, is that he deals with human beings not just as physical creatures. And this is where violence acts, right? Violence tries to constrain the body, deals with people as animals in some ultimate sense. But he appeals to the soul, that which, of course, is denied. Its existence is even denied by many. But King appeals to the conscience, right? That nonviolence in response to violence is difficult to deal with, right? When you hit somebody and instead of hitting you back, they turn the other cheek, right? Figuratively or literally. you don't know what to do with that. And in the moment, maybe you take advantage of that. Right? Maybe you act, but there's the possibility of a conscience being pricked by that in a way that a response that's violence with violence doesn't allow for. We get that, right? When you hit somebody and they hit you back, there's nothing that has to be explained there. We understand how that works. But the argument that it can be spiritually aggressive to be nonviolent because you're appealing to that more essential part of the human being, the conscience, that which is beyond the mere physical, is something that provides the foundation for the emergence of a community bound together by love, even if that can't be achieved full sense this side of Christ's kingdom.
Well, you've just described the cross, right, which is the ultimate act of that love and God's love for us, and that reconciliation, that true and the only true reconciliation that can come between all of those things that divide us as human beings, but more appropriately divide us from God Himself. It produces, I think, likewise within you a sense of humility before the judgment of God. And you see this humility in Lincoln, and you see it in Lincoln's second inaugural. He notes full well, right, that God has His plan for mankind, and we try to do our best in this world to try to figure out what the right is. But at the end of the day, that He will judge the world and judge our actions, and that hopefully that will produce within us a right ordering of our soul. So more to be said on that, but I think that hopefully we've begun to touch upon some of the ways of thinking about this issue, drawing back and seeing it as a human problem among a much more complex assessment of the human condition.
So as we begin to wrap things up for our second to last segment, where we open the grade book, we're going to focus on political leaders and their response to the events of this week, and kind of talk through how their response interacts with the principles we've just been describing. How have they acted in light of the guidance of a King, of a Lincoln, a Arendt, and Homer. So how about, let's start with President Trump. What do you make of President Trump's role in all of this?
I think he had a terrible week. I think that if he could get this week back, he probably could. I don't know what he'd grade himself, but it'd have to be something close to an F. And I say that not from a never Trump voice. I'm not a never Trumper at all. And I think a lot of what President Trump has done, albeit sometimes without civility, to take on political correctness and to take on the desire among some to silence a large majority of Americans is quite heroic. But you don't see the language employed by Lincoln in the second inaugural. You don't see kind of an understanding of, yes, it's very important for a leader to secure the peace through law and order. But that leader also within our democratic republic has to be one who is encouraging liberty, who is also encouraging a sense of justice and balancing this deference paid to justice, deference paid to peace, deference paid to law and order, and deference paid to liberty. It's an incredibly difficult task, especially when you're hated. But I don't think he had a good week at all, Matt.
I agree, Dave. A very difficult week for President Trump. He seems to be at his best when he is able to counterpunch, when he's in the ring politically, and he's able to define some enemies to attack. And this was not a week for that. This was a week for a unifying voice. This was a week where even the message of law and order, which was obviously a necessary part of the message, but to emphasize that in the way that he did, really, I think at the expense of competing considerations of justice, and just the kind of the language and demeanor that goes along with it. Right? He seems to have this need to show himself to be tough, and sometimes that really doesn't suit the occasion. And again, I think this was one of those situations where it just made things worse. There's so much that has happened that's already made his relationship with the media and the left and large parts of the population so difficult. There may be no way at this stage to be everybody's president in a sense that people can easily applaud. But I think there's still the obligation to make that effort, as much as depends upon you. Be at peace with all men. And I don't think we saw that from President Trump this week. Well, our last segment each week is what we call the Tocqueville's crystal ball, and we try to make a prediction for the week to come. Last week we focused on the reopening of sports leagues. We were hoping that Major League Baseball, the NHL, and NBA would all have settled plans by this time this week, and we found that the NBA does. Major League Baseball seems to be not in a great place. A lot of tension between the owners and the players. And the NHL, it's got a plan, but no date yet. So this week, looking ahead and trying to think about, is there any silver lining in the very gray clouds that have been covering our country really for months at this point? We're going to try to make predictions for something that's going to go well. Our focus this week is on what will go well next week. Maybe surprisingly, maybe something that we could see is there's some indications on the horizon. But what are you predicting, Dave, that we can cheer and be thankful for next week?
Well, I don't know if it's my Texas bias being here where we've kind of gone from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3, and we may be at phase 10 by now. I don't know, but we're pretty close to normal. I think my prediction, my hopeful prediction for the upcoming week is that there will be a reopening of the American way of life. And with that reopening will come some encouragement. I think getting out and seeing people, seeing loved ones, friends, and all the rest will move us toward a better societal state of mind. I think one of the problems or unintended consequences of social distancing is it tends to produce kind of a antisocial mindset. So hopefully that will be on the decline, and the type of happiness that we get in being with one another will be on the rise this week.
Yeah, it's a great observation. It really is tough to see people as fully formed humans when all you've got is a connection across an email or across the way when you're not able to be together. I think we need that kind of community. And there's just the kind of low level stress of dealing with a life that we haven't chosen and that presents the challenges, the tensions, the worries that are always there, maybe in some parts of the country more consistently than others. I'm going to make a prediction along similar lines and project that, contrary to fears and maybe some expectations, that there will be really no appreciable increase in incidence of COVID-19 in consequence of the protests and rallies of the last week. So I know there's a lot of people that are worried about that, and there's a lot of observations about people not respecting social distancing. We can talk about the political side of that, but that's not what I want to focus on here. I think there's going to be perhaps some good news that, ironically, perhaps that these protests have allowed us to test the necessities for some of the outdoor social distancing that we've been told we need to follow, and that I'm predicting things will go better than expected. And that will be an encouragement for us to be able to get out and maybe not always looking over our shoulder. Is there somebody coming down the sidewalk that I've got to dodge and be just this far away as I go about my business? It'd be nice not to have that divided thought as you're out there enjoying the summer sun.
So Matt, I know you're not a medical doctor, but are you suggesting in your prediction that the 6 foot rule goes down to 2 feet or 3 feet, or you don't want to get there?
I am not going to go there in the least degree. I am not a
Okay.
doctor, and I'm not going to make any judgments about that. I'm just going to be optimistic, right? That God, by God's grace, by consequences of outside airflow or whatever else, that we're going to be pleasantly surprised that we don't get a significant uptick in COVID-19 cases in some of the cities where we've seen large-scale protests and rallies. So we're grateful for you sticking with us to the end here. This has been a challenging week and a challenging program, but we want to try to think through these things ourselves and provide some resources for others to do the same. We'd encourage you, if you haven't already, to subscribe to the podcast. You can do that through Apple. You can do that on Google, Spotify, as well as Stitcher. We're glad to hear from you, glad to get your feedback, and we look forward to being back with you again, Lord willing, next week.